Hey, I'm Hank, the guy who runs the Death by Media Man podcast and video channel, and this is Army of Me, a recap program for the FX series Legion. So Legion is back! I was a big fan of the first season. I'd go so far as to say I think it was the most entertaining TV show ever adapted from a superhero comic book. Most intelligent as well, and most beautiful and surreal. I'd say it put really big X's in all the squares that were important to me. Here's a quick word about me. I probably read my first X-Men comic back in the 80s, before I was even 10 years old. My dad read them before me, and he had big boxes of the old Claremont Burn stuff that I got into when I was tiny. I bought the Lee Claremont X-Men #1 when it came out in 1991, and I was a fan of the franchise for years. As an adult, my favorite X-Men material would have to be the Grant Morrison years. Like Legion, I feel like Morrison managed to take the mythos of the X-Men and raise it up into an even higher form of storytelling, something like that. Made it even fucking better. But hey, that's enough about me. Let's get into the show. This is episode 1 of season 2, entitled Chapter 9, and it was written by Noah Hawley. He's the guy who kind of runs the whole show, and Nathan Halpern. Halpern? Ugh. I hope I'm probably not saying anybody's name right. It was directed by Tim Millance? Ugh, Jesus Christ. I'm terrible at this part. Season 1 is a bit big to condense, but it basically ended with David Haller, a powerful mutant psychic and schizophrenic, being kidnapped by a tiny silver ball. I'm going to pretend that you've seen season 1 and that you're watching season 2 if you're listening to this, because otherwise this shit isn't going to make a lot of sense. We open with David being discovered in a nightclub, and there's something wrong with him. His teammates take him to the headquarters for Division 3. Their former enemies, now they're co-workers. There, we learn that while David says that he thinks he's only been missing for a day, he's actually been gone for a year. As the episode progresses, we learn that perhaps he's more aware of time having passed than he's admitting. We learn that Division 3 has teamed up with, or rather begun employing, David's mutant compatriots, and this is to aid in the hunt for the Shadow King. The Shadow King is a powerful psychic force without a body, and it's quite evil and perverse. He was the villain of the last season, and it looks like he'll be staying the villain of the series. He's a mutant, like David is. But again, I don't need to tell you that, do I? You know what mutants are, you're listening to this. See, it turns out the Shadow King is hunting for his physical body, as finding it will increase his powers. So now we can see it's a race between David and his team and the Shadow King. But we also learn that the orb which kidnapped David may have been sent from the future by David's girlfriend, Sid, who then uses the secret space of the orb to warn David that he might need to help the Shadow King instead of fighting him. This is spliced in with plenty of weird conversations, intense dance sequences, horror stories, and even a Zen parable. It's a lot of stuff, all crammed into a single hour of television. Not unlike David himself, who has a lot of stuff crammed into his single mind. So let's get into the notes that I made. The Shadow King is like a nesting doll. There's personalities within personalities and minds within minds within minds. How deep does it go, and who knows what's going on? Like, how many levels of awareness are there? It seems like Lenny and Oliver are trapped within the Shadow King's head, who is still trapped within Oliver's mind. It's hard to tell like what level of reality anybody's aware of. There's a few references to a maze. And what is the maze? It seems to be something that happens inside people's minds. It's almost like the maze is a metaphor for insanity? Like getting lost inside your own head. I don't know, I think that's what it is anyways. We spend a little bit of time with Sid, who seems to be getting better with her powers. We watch her switch in and out of the body of a cat at will, which is pretty cute. Previously, Sid's powers weren't really in her control, so I think they're trying to show that she's getting a little bit more of a grip on it. We meet this character, Admiral Fukuyama. He reminds me a lot of the X-Men character Zorn, both of them having shit on their heads. Zorn had the heart of a star for a brain. He didn't, as it turns out, but the way it was presented in the story is that's what it was, and he had to keep it encased within a lead helmet that was shaped like a skull. Admiral Fukuyama just has a basket on his head, and apparently speaks through a psychic hive mind. They're really not giving us too much. There's a lot of just like crazy weird shit going on, but it creates a really cool atmosphere. Speaking of which, I love all the warnings constantly being announced in the headquarters for Division 3. Beware of thoughts that are not your own. Good advice for us all. It's crazy seeing the team of mutants now working with Division 3, who was one of the main enemies of the last season. I thought maybe they'd move past the Shadow King, ending his story in Season 1, but it looks like he's staying the primary villain, which I like. He's a good enemy. It's terrible watching Sid deal with her year of missing David. It's heartbreaking. And on the other side of that is Melanie, formerly the leader of the mutants, whose own lover, Oliver, is the current kidnapped host of the Shadow King. Melanie seems perhaps broken by her grief, but also galvanized into a force for mutant rights. I think she might also be getting into some weird drugs and sex stuff. But then hey, aren't we all? Speaking of which, sex happens for David and Sid. It's mental sex because they can't touch. I guess it's fun. I don't know. I'm a little underwhelmed by TV sex scenes. Here's a question, and maybe I shouldn't just be popping this right now, but it just comes up here in my notes because I guess it's what happens sequentially in the show. Is Lenny the Shadow King? And if not, what is Lenny? That's the character Aubrey Plaza plays. It seems like she's trapped inside the Shadow King too, but she is the Shadow King. I don't know. The Shadow King seems to be spreading some kind of a mental plague. Like he touches people's minds and then they're trapped. Trapped in the maze? Maybe. We got lots of drugs and delusions in this episode, in this show in general. There's this story of a man who chops off his own leg, and this is presented with the idea that bad ideas can spread and grow within a person. We see mental eggs that are hatching bad, weird little ideas. Inky spiders hatching out of chicken eggs. And Lenny, or the Shadow King, is nurturing those bad ideas. She's nurturing these delusions. Does David know what's real? Can David know what's real? Is that something within his powers? We spent some time with Clark, one of the human leaders of Division X. Previously, he'd been hunting David and his people, and Clark had been horribly injured and scarred from their interactions. Now he has to play nice with David while still being sort of authority figure. I like Clark a lot. He's one of my favorite characters. It's a great actor. Hamish Linklater, I love him. He's definitely one of the standout characters from this whole show, which is saying a lot because he's one of the humans, and traditionally they're not really as interesting as the mutant characters. So it's being well handled. Admiral Fukuyama is the head of Division 3, and I use that term semi-ironically, as we do not see his head. He wears a basket over his head, and he speaks through several auto-tuned, mustachioed women. It's like the X-Men characters, the Midwich Cuckoos, the Psychic Sisters who shared a powerful mind, taken even further. And now there are like a few voices inside David's head, and the voices are all starting to talk to each other. It's like we're seeing him evolve into the character that he is in the comics. So yeah, we're given this idea that this season will be a race through a maze, and at the center of that maze is the physical form of the Shadow King. Or is it? I don't know. We get to see some cool tech. We get sort of a thing like Professor X's Cerebro meets an isolation tank, which I enjoy. We also get to spend some time with the Carrie's Loudermilk again. They're really fun, and again, one of my favorite parts of the show. There's sort of a weird evolution or interpretation of the multiple man powers. We get this great scene in a club where several psychics show off by having a synchronized dance contest. At least that's what I think is going on. Psychics dueling through synchronized dance is a powerful bit of imagery which works perfectly for a live-action show. It exceeds the expectations placed on previous adaptations of the mutant mindset. I just had fun saying that. It sort of makes the other X-Men movies look honestly kind of pathetic. This is intelligent, challenging new ways to look at how you visually and narratively represent mutant powers and psychic minds. Sometimes something is so good, it makes you disappointed with everything else, and that's how good this is. I like all the music, especially the stuff that seems to be created just for the show. I do not like David lying to Sid. His honesty with her, their connection, is maybe his greatest redeeming quality, and I don't like seeing him lose it. And yeah, finally, it's suggested that during David's missing year, at least while he was still inside the strange little orb that kidnapped him at the end of Season 1, Sid was communicating to him secretly. The idea seems to be that Sid is speaking to David from the future, trying to convince him to help the Shadow King. I don't know how to feel about any of that. It would be really easy to lie to David, but he also seems to know Sid too well for somebody to deceive him that way. And she sent the orb? The orb is confusing at best. I sort of hated it when it first showed up at the end of last season. We'd never seen any kind of technology like that in the series previously, and I felt like it kind of negatively impacted the reality of the show. Anyway, this series is so friggin' Grant Morrison that I expect Morrison himself to walk into a scene at some point. It's got traces of his X-Men and his Doom Patrol all over it. Or maybe that's just something I see when I watch it, because I'm really into Grant Morrison's X-Men and Doom Patrol. Ultimately, the biggest thing I don't like about what's going on in this episode is David being a liar. I get that David is both the hero and the villain of the story, but I don't enjoy watching him lie to his friends and his lover. The trope of a character saying nothing's wrong when something's wrong is a trope I'm getting really sick of. I also kind of fear the show falling too far into the realms of David Lynch. I like madness, but I want some coherency. There wasn't a ton of that in this episode, but given how good the last season was and how weird it was at first and how well it explained itself as it went on, I got a lot of confidence that this season is also going to be really confusing and really satisfying. So if those are some of the things I didn't like, what did I like? Pretty much everything. It's a clever show. The episode didn't give us much to grab onto, but it was still a fun ride, much like the first episode of the first season. I suspect that we'll soon be learning a lot more about all this confusing stuff. All in all, an excellent episode, and a great start to the second season. I'm excited to see what kind of story they're going to tell us. Well, that'll be about it for me for this episode. Thanks so much for listening, and feel free to share and like and subscribe and look into supporting us on Patreon and all that shit. Until next time, I've been Hank, you've been wonderful, and this has been Army of Me. And remember, just because it's all in your head doesn't mean it's not real. Later, skaters.